A bear was crying to lure a man into the woods. What he found after following it will leave you speechless. The late afternoon sun cast golden streaks through the thick canopy, dappling the forest floor with a warm glow. Ethan adjusted the strap of his canvas bag and glanced at the trees around him. This forest, dense and untouched, was supposed to be perfect for what he needed. The presentation was tomorrow, the plight of endangered species, and he wanted more than just textbook facts. He hoped to find something real, tangible to hold in his hands when he spoke to his classmates. The familiar crunch of fallen leaves underfoot was comforting as he ventured deeper. The forest seemed alive, yet strangely subdued, with faint rustlings of unseen creatures in the underbrush. A faint uneasiness stirred within him. He brushed it off and focused on the task at hand. A bird call echoed faintly in the distance, followed by the whisper of wind threading through the branches. Then he saw it. At first it was just a shadow between the trees, a mass that didn't belong to the natural shapes of the forest. Ethan stopped, his heart thumping loudly as the form shifted and stepped into the light. It was a bear. A brown bear, massive in size, but clearly not in its prime. Its fur hung in matted clumps, streaked with dirt and signs of old injuries. Fresh blood oozed sluggishly from deep gashes on its legs. But the most striking feature was its eyes, tired, sunken, as if carrying a weight beyond pain. Panic swept over Ethan. His pulse quickened and his mind raced through every survival tip he had ever read. His instinct screamed at him to lie still, to not make a sound. He dropped to the ground, his cheek pressing against the cool earth, his breathing shallow. Minutes crawled by, stretching endlessly. Every rustle of leaves, every crackle of twigs made Ethan brace for the worst. Yet nothing came. No growls, no thunderous charge of paws. Finally, against his better judgment, he cracked one eye open. The bear was still there. It wasn't attacking. It wasn't moving at all, save for the slow rise and fall of its massive chest. It was sitting, almost as if waiting. Its gaze rested on Ethan, calm yet expectant, like a teacher waiting for a student to look up. Ethan's muscles ached from holding still, but curiosity was beginning to eclipse his fear. Slowly, cautiously, he raised his head. His heart still pounded, but his hands had stopped trembling. The bear tilted its head ever so slightly, its expression unreadable yet oddly gentle. "What do you want?" Ethan whispered, the words barely audible. The bear did not respond, of course, but neither did it react aggressively. Instead, it shifted its massive bulk and rose to its feet. Ethan tensed, ready to flee, but the bear didn't approach him. It turned, lumbering away through the trees. After a few steps, it paused and glanced back over its shoulder, as if checking to see if Ethan was following. He stared after it, frozen by indecision. This was insane. No one in their right mind would follow a bear into the forest. But then again, nothing about this situation felt normal. That gaze, that stillness. It was as if the bear wasn't just an animal. It was something more. His thoughts swirled with doubt and unease. Was this some bizarre trap? Was he imagining things? Yet, a pull stronger than fear began to take hold. The bear moved again, a slow, deliberate pace, its head turning occasionally to ensure Ethan was still watching. Ethan inhaled sharply, as though he needed to anchor himself in the present moment. Then, without fully understanding why, he pushed himself to his feet and took a hesitant step forward. The bear didn't react, continuing its measured path deeper into the forest. Ethan followed at a cautious distance, his eyes darting to the bear's wounds, its uneven gait. There was a quiet dignity to its movements, a determination that Ethan couldn't help but respect. The light began to fade as the sun dipped lower, casting long shadows that reached hungrily across the forest floor. The air felt heavier, cooler, as they ventured deeper into the woods. Ethan's mind churned with questions. Where was it taking him? Why had it waited for him? And above all, what was he hoping to find? Step by step, the forest grew darker, the trail less defined. Ethan adjusted his bag again, his resolve strengthening. Whatever this was, whatever strange, inexplicable event he had stumbled into, it felt too important to walk away from. Ahead, the bear plodded on, its form silhouetted against the last rays of sunlight. Ethan followed, his heart both heavy and hopeful, stepping into the unknown. The forest seemed to shift as Ethan followed the bear. Each step he took felt purposeful, as though he were treading on a path he was meant to find. The air was cooler here, damp with the scent of earth and moss. The further he went, the more the world around him seemed to change. He couldn't quite put his finger on it, but something about this place tugged at his memory. The way the trees bent in peculiar shapes, their gnarled branches curling like ancient hands, felt oddly familiar. A trickle of unease mingled with curiosity. It was the kind of sensation one gets when standing in a place long forgotten, but somehow remembered in dreams. The bear moved steadily ahead, its steps deliberate as if it knew every root and stone on the path. Ethan hesitated now and then, his breath hitching when the bear glanced back at him. Its amber eyes, even in their weariness, held a strange calm, urging him forward. The trees thickened, their shadows stretching longer as the daylight waned. The path grew narrower, lined with tangled undergrowth that snagged Ethan's jeans and slowed his steps. The bear, however, moved with ease, skirting obstacles with surprising agility for such a massive creature. Ahead, the sound of rushing water broke the silence. Ethan quickened his pace, weaving through the trees until he reached a clearing. A wide river cut through the forest, its surface rippling with an unforgiving current. Ethan stopped, his chest tightening at the sight of a rickety bridge spanning the water. It wasn't much of a bridge, more a haphazard collection of logs and vines that sagged under its own weight. The bear stepped onto it without hesitation, its massive paws testing each timber with care. Ethan watched, his throat dry as the bridge creaked and swayed beneath the bear's weight. "No way," Ethan whispered, shaking his head. "That thing's going to snap any second." The bear reached the other side and turned to look at him. Its gaze was steady, almost expectant. Ethan felt a lump rise in his throat. He glanced at the water, the roaring sound of the current pounding in his ears. A fall from that height would be unforgiving. He forced himself to breathe. "You're out of your mind," he muttered to himself, gripping the frayed rope railing as he stepped onto the first log. The bridge groaned under his weight, and his heart hammered in his chest. One step, then another. The logs shifted beneath him, the vines creaking like old bones. He tried not to look down, focusing instead on the bear waiting patiently on the other side. The gap between them felt enormous, the distance stretching further with every cautious step. Halfway across, a gust of wind swept through the clearing, causing the bridge to sway. Ethan froze, gripping the ropes tighter, his knuckles white. For a moment he felt the weight of the forest around him, the vastness of it pressing down on his small, trembling form. The bear didn't move. It simply stood there, its calm presence anchoring Ethan's fear. "Okay," Ethan whispered. "Just a little further." He forced his feet to move, inching toward solid ground. With one last leap, he stepped onto the opposite bank, his legs shaking beneath him. He looked back at the bridge, then at the bear. "You could have warned me," he muttered, though he knew the absurdity of speaking to it. The bear turned and continued on its way, unbothered by Ethan's struggles. Ethan followed again, though something had shifted within him. The fear that had clung to him earlier now felt muted, replaced by an inexplicable sense of trust. This creature, battered and worn as it was, seemed to know what it was doing. The forest grew darker as they ventured further, the once familiar sounds of birds and rustling leaves fading, replaced by a heavy silence. Ethan adjusted the strap of his bag and kept moving, his eyes scanning the shadows. Then he saw it, a shape looming ahead barely visible through the trees. As they drew closer, the outline of a large structure emerged, its edges softened by creeping vines and decay. Ethan stopped in his tracks, his breath catching in his throat. It was a circus tent, or at least what was left of one. The canvas was tattered and discolored, sagging under the weight of time. Broken cages, their bars rusted and bent, dotted the area like forgotten relics. The air felt heavier here, thick with something Ethan couldn't name. The bear stopped just short of the clearing, sitting down as if to wait. Ethan's gaze darted from the tent to the bear, a knot forming in his stomach. "What is this place?" he whispered. The question lingered in the air, unanswered, as Ethan took his first step toward the forgotten ruin. The sight before Ethan felt unreal. What had once been a place of wonder, laughter, and applause was now a hollowed-out shadow of its former self. The tattered remains of a faded red and yellow circus tent swayed gently in the breeze, its once bright colors dulled to muted shades of gray and brown. Bent iron poles, rusted through time and neglect, jutted at odd angles like forgotten sentinels guarding the ruins. Ethan stepped forward, his boots crunching on broken glass and debris. The heavy air seemed to settle on him like a weight, pressing against his chest. The sounds of the forest faded into the background, replaced by an eerie, oppressive silence. Scattered around the clearing were the remnants of the circus's former glory. A collapsed Ferris wheel loomed in the distance, its skeletal frame tangled in vines. Broken cages, their bars warped and stained with rust, lay abandoned, as if the wild animals they once held had long since escaped, or perished. Ethan froze as a flicker of recognition stirred within him. This place wasn't unfamiliar. The sensation hit him like a sudden gust of cold wind, prickling the back of his neck. Memories dormant for years began to surface. He'd been here before, as a child. His breath caught as images flashed through his mind, holding his father's hand, the smell of popcorn and sawdust, the excited chatter of a crowd. It had been 10 years ago during a chilly November weekend before Thanksgiving. His father, David Stephen, had brought him here to watch the animals perform. Ethan could still recall the twinkle in his father's eyes as he explained the behavior of the elephants, the agility of the tigers. But that had been the last time he'd seen his father. The memory sharpened, painful and raw. His father had disappeared that very weekend, leaving no trace. The search parties had scoured the forest and nearby towns, but they found nothing. Ethan and his mother had left the area soon after, unable to bear the weight of uncertainty and loss. They had never spoken about the circus again. Yet here it was, standing like a ghost from his past, bringing with it a flood of emotions he had tried to bury. A rustling sound pulled Ethan from his thoughts. He turned to see the bear, now standing near a massive empty cage. Its frame was larger than the others, its iron bars twisted as if some great force had bent them. The bear lowered its head and paused, motionless as if paying homage to the place. Ethan's chest tightened. Was this where it had been kept? Forced to perform for crowds who cheered while it suffered in silence? The thought struck him deeply, and he felt a pang of sorrow that went beyond words. The bear lifted its head slightly, its gaze drifting across the clearing. Ethan followed its line of sight to another cage, smaller, but still intact. Inside, a tiger lay curled in the shadows, its once majestic coat now dull and patchy. The animal's ribs showed beneath its thin skin, and its eyes glimmered faintly, dulled by exhaustion and despair. Nearby, an elephant stood in a makeshift pen, swaying gently from side to side. Its massive frame seemed diminished by age and neglect, and its trunk occasionally reached out as if searching for something, perhaps comfort, perhaps hope. Ethan felt a lump rise in his throat. He wanted to look away, but he couldn't. The sight of these creatures, so broken yet still alive, filled him with a deep, aching sadness. He thought of his father again, how passionate he'd been about protecting animals, how he'd spoken of them as if they were equals, deserving of respect and care. The bear moved again, drawing Ethan's attention back. It stopped in front of the large empty cage and lowered itself to the ground. Its head dipped slightly, almost reverently. And for the first time, Ethan saw it as more than a wild animal. This bear had a story, a history of suffering and survival that mirrored the desolation around them. Ethan stepped closer, his heart pounding with a mix of awe and sorrow. He knelt a short distance from the bear, his gaze fixed on its massive frame. "This was your cage," he whispered, the words barely audible. "Wasn't it?" The bear didn't respond, of course, but there was something in the way it sat, still solemn, that answered his question. Ethan's hands curled into fists at his sides. He could feel the anger rising within him, Not at the bear or the circus, but at the people who had allowed this to happen. The same people who had likely taken his father. The same ones who had left these creatures to rot. His eyes met the bear's, and for a moment they shared a quiet understanding. Whatever had brought him here, whatever had drawn him to this forgotten place, it wasn't over. The circus held answers. He could feel it. And Ethan wasn't leaving until he found them. Ethan moved cautiously, his footsteps muffled by dirt and decaying leaves. Behind him, the bear lumbered quietly, its massive frame almost ghost-like in the dim light. Ethan's heart raced with a growing sense of urgency. The animals he had seen, thin, weak, their gazes hollow, could not wait much longer. Ahead, he spotted a row of rusting cages. The sight made his chest tighten. He hurried toward them, the bear following close behind. The first cage held nothing, rusted bars bent inward, and the ground inside was scattered with old straw, damp and rotting. But then, a sound, a low, guttural groan, came from the far end of the row. Ethan turned, his eyes scanning until he spotted movement in the shadows. It was a gorilla. The animal was hunched in a corner, its once powerful body reduced to a pitiful state. Its fur was patchy, its movements sluggish. Ethan knelt near the cage, his voice soft. "Hey there," he whispered. "I'm going to get you out of here." The gorilla's dark eyes met his, reflecting exhaustion, but also a flicker of hope. Ethan searched for a way to open the rusted lock, but it was jammed tight, the mechanism long fused by time and neglect. The bear stood nearby, watching Ethan's every move. "Come on," Ethan muttered, gripping the lock with trembling hands. "We have to get you out." He glanced at the bear, as if expecting it to understand. In a strange way, it seemed to. The bear shifted closer, sniffing the lock and nudging it with its nose. But it didn't budge. Minutes stretched into what felt like hours. Ethan's frustration grew, his hands scraped and raw from trying to force the lock. The sense of helplessness was crushing. Finally, with a sharp twist, the rusted metal gave way, and the cage door creaked open. The gorilla hesitated, its massive hand resting on the edge of the cage, as though unsure of its newfound freedom. "It's okay," Ethan said softly. "You're free now." The animal stepped out, moving gingerly, its movements stiff. Ethan watched it for a moment, relief mixing with a pang of sorrow. One life saved, but how many others had already been lost? He stood and looked back at the bear. Its gaze was steady, as if urging him to press on. The deeper Ethan went into the remains of the circus, the darker the atmosphere became. The once bright colors of the tents had faded to drab, lifeless hues. Broken equipment lay scattered. A Ferris wheel loomed in the distance, its skeletal frame swaying in the wind. But what drew Ethan's attention most were the cages, row after row of them, all empty. He could imagine the creatures that once filled these rusted prisons, tigers pacing, parrots squawking, elephants swaying in endless repetition. The silence now was deafening, a grim testament to the horrors that had unfolded here. His search led him to a small office tucked into the back corner of the grounds. The door hung crookedly on its hinges, and the floor was littered with crumpled papers and broken furniture. Ethan knelt and began sifting through the mess. Most of the documents were faded and brittle, their ink smudged with time. But some pages remained legible. His eyes widened as he read. Names, species listed one after another. Bengal tiger, snow leopard, western lowland gorilla. Notes in the margins detailed transactions, dates, and destinations. This was it, Ethan murmured, his voice barely above a whisper. This was where it all happened. He shoved the papers into his bag, his hands trembling. The weight of it all was overwhelming, proof of a monstrous operation hidden in the heart of the forest. As he turned to leave, something on the far desk caught his eye. A hat. It was old, its brim worn and frayed but unmistakable. Ethan reached for it, his breath catching as he flipped it over. The name stitched inside made his knees weaken. David Stephen, his father's name. The memories came rushing back. His father's gentle voice, the way he always wore this hat on their outings to the woods. the day he disappeared. Ethan had clung to the hope that he'd come back. But here, in this forsaken place, the truth was beginning to take shape. He clutched the hat tightly, his mind racing. What had his father been doing here? Was